Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riders from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, professional horse trainer, and with me again is my friend Deb Romero, um, certified Alexander Technique instructor. Today's topic is bits and bridles. This is kind of a big topic, but I
Kind of
think
huge.
let's try to make it simple.
I like that idea.
Yeah. So you want to start with bits or you want to start with bridles? Those are two different things.
I think we should start with bits.
With bits.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why not?
So, well, there's essentially two types of bits. No matter what, the configuration, will go into the mouthpieces and all of that. But the essential two types of bits are snaffle bits and what we call leverage bits or curb bits.
I like keeping it that simple. Yes.
Yeah. So, what do you think defines a snaffle bit from a curb bit?
I can think of a lot of different things that define it. A snaffle to me usually has what I call a break in it in the middle. It's like pieces and then it hooked together in the middle.
So, like a jointed mouthpiece.
Yeah. Yeah. And your leverage points, which I'm sure you'll go into, are different than, say, the curb bit, which is a different type of
That's
leverage.
exactly the difference is
Yeah.
leverage. And
Yeah.
so what you said is what most people think that defines a snaffle is a jointed mouthpiece.
Right.
It's actually not.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that's such a common way to perceive snaffle bits is that the mouthpiece is jointed.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with the mouthpiece at all. So you can actually have like a classical driving training bit is called a straight bar snaffle. So it has
Right. I've
no
seen
joint,
those.
right? No joint in the mouthpiece, but it's still a snaffle. So what actually defines a snaffle from a curb bit is where the reins are attached.
Hmm.
So on any snaffle, the reins are always going to be attached at the corner of the horse's mouth.
Okay.
And that's what makes the leverage difference. On any leveraged bit or curb bit, a curb always has what's called a shank, which is a piece of metal that goes from the corner of the horse's mouth downward.
Right.
And it can be 1 inches, 2 inches. The really massively leveraged bits can be over 4 inches long.
Wow.
Yeah. So if the reins attach to the bit right at the corner of the horse's mouth on either side of the lips, that's snaffle leverage.
Okay.
That's a snaffle bit. If the reins attach anywhere, if there's a metal device that hangs down from the corners of the horse's mouth and the reins attach there to the bottom of the metal piece, which is below the corners of the mouth, that's a curb bit. So you can have a snaffle with a straight mouthpiece, and you can
Okay.
have a curb bit with a jointed mouthpiece,
Okay.
right? So what changes the leverage action of the reins is whether or not they're attached, right, on either side of the horse's mouth or below the horse's mouth.
Right.
And the farther below, like the longer the shanks or the farther below the horse's mouth the reins attach, the more leverage you have through the reins.
That's just I'm very interested in the whys of either one.
Good question.
Yeah.
So,
'Cause that always fascinates me. Like, why do you use that? Could
so
it be fashion? I mean, I'm sure there's fashion.
there's a little bit of fashion that plays into it, thanks to some of our breed societies. But traditionally, whether you're riding English or Western, all young horses are started in a snaffle bit.
Right.
The main difference not only more or less leverage. And what do I mean by leverage? What I mean by leverage is in a snaffle bit, for every pound of pressure the rider puts on the reins or feels on the reins, on a snaffle bit, the horse is feeling maybe 10 pounds in the mouth to every 1 pound we feel in our hand. As
Wow.
soon as you add the reins below the mouth, you're going to increase that a lot. So, like, let's say on a 2-inch shank, which means the reins are hanging 2 inches below the horse's mouth, you've increased that sort of pounds per square inch
Mm-hmm.
application of pressure. It's now gone from maybe 10 to 1 to 100 to 1.
Wow.
So for every
Wow.
1 pound of pressure you're feeling in your hand on the reins, the horse is feeling 50 or 100 pounds of pressure in the mouth. That's what leverage is, right? So
Right.
just
And
like,
it's in both English and Western. It's not, because I'm thinking the full bridle in English, there's a shank on that
oh yeah.
too.
So traditional training, you start young horses in a snaffle. That's considered a training bit. And in the upper levels of both Western and English disciplines, you ride in a curb,
Interesting.
right? So why?
That's,
I always
yeah,
got to know
why?
why.
What the
Why?
heck?
So the main difference between the action, whether you have more or less leverage, to me, the important part of working in a snaffle is you feel through the reins distinct changes in the left to right aspect of balance. So in a snaffle bit, if you have more pressure on the left rein compared to the right rein, then you know the horse is not in balance left to right, which could have to do with
Okay.
lateral bending of the spine, crookedness, or rotation, the twisting of the spine. So in a snaffle bit, the left and right reins are clearly separated. So you get a clear change
It's like a
left.
direct line,
Yes, it's a direct line to the left side of the
direct line of
horse,
communication from hand to mouth.
right, on the left
Yeah.
side and the right side. And if you use both reins at the same time, you still have a good amount of leverage sort of on the front to back dimension,
Mm,
right? So the
okay.
front to back dimension would be if the horse is falling forward, losing control over their body weight, we might hold the reins and resist the fall forward. So as the horse puts too much body weight on the front legs, the rein pressure increases as a deterrent so that the horse says, "Ooh, I don't like this. Let me rearrange and engage my hindquarters, lift my back, pick myself up, control my body weight." And it's the body weight falling forward that makes a horse heavy on the reins,
Right.
right? So in a snaffle bit, you still have that ability to deter the fall forward, which is a front to back balance issue, right? But you also have a clear distinction of the horse's weight shifting left or right,
Yeah.
right? So for young horse training where you're developing balance, you don't want too much leverage, right? Front to back. And you definitely want that isolation left to right because you're developing internal straightness, you're developing balance, you're developing
Right.
self-carriage, right? So, and I've ridden Western and English, and both, even the best cowboys start with a light feel on the reins. It's not a slack rein and in a snaffle bit. So across the board, that's how young horses are traditionally trained. Now, everybody has a different opinion, including horses, not just people, whether the mouthpiece, if they prefer a solid piece or a jointed piece, right?
Well, how
So
would you know? What would be the signs? that you're looking for if this is the bit my horse likes?
So the best professional to help us choose a bit for our horse is our equine dentist
Uh,
because
okay.
every horse has a unique shape to their mouth.
Cool.
So traditionally, we start with thicker mouthpieces, softer mouthpieces. So again, the thicker the mouthpiece, the less leverage you have because the
Okay.
thickness of the mouthpiece is going to distribute that pressure over a greater surface area. The thinner the mouthpiece, the harsher it can be,
Okay.
right? But some horses don't have a lot of space between their teeth. Like I had a young horse who just had kind of a his jaw was just sort of in a way where his teeth came in. He had very little area for the bit,
Interesting. I never
right?
thought about that.
So I started him in the traditional thicker mouthpiece, like they call rubber bones for a lot of
Right, I
baby
remember
training.
those.
They're like a rubber mouthpiece, but it's solid.
Hmm.
And he just stuck his tongue out all the time. He fussed with the bit. He didn't like it. Like he gave me lots of behavioral things that just kind of continued and continued. And then I had a very thin single jointed snaffle mouthpiece, and I put that in his mouth just to try it, and he was quieter. So that's kind of how I knew he preferred it. But then my dentist confirmed, he goes, "Wow, I would not use a thick bit on this horse. He
Oh,
does,
wow.
he has no space between his teeth." And I said, "Yeah, he's definitely happier in the thinner mouthpiece, even though that goes against the traditional way."
Right.
Right. And he wasn't hard to control. I didn't need the leverage, but he definitely was quieter with a thinner bit because that was just how his jaw was and how his teeth were. So,
That's always fascinated me because my horses have opinions about their bits, that's for sure.
yes. Yeah. And we'll go into mouthpieces a little more, but let's get back on track with what were we talking about? The snaffle, why use the snaffle versus why use the curb,
A curb, yeah.
the leverage. And like I said, the snaffle is a traditional training tool for all young horses. And theoretically, as the horse advances and develops self-carriage in balance, the curb is meant to be a more stable bit where the rein action is quite light just to help the horse maintain self-carriage. So by the time a horse is moving into a curb in advanced training, they should be very strong in their self-carriage. So
I think
this,
that's critical because I don't see that.
I don't see that either.
Sorry.
Yeah. And so
Sorry, everybody.
what's happened is sort of the industry tells us, whether it's breeding organizations or show organizations, the industry tells us you should start your horse at 2 or 3, and as a 5-year-old, they should be in self-carriage and you move them into the curb. And I
Wow.
go, there's a window in there. Maybe you start them between 2 and 3, and maybe they're in the curb between 5 and 7. But I go, there's so little actual self-carriage out there that
Hmm.
we're putting horses in these leveraged bits before they actually can carry themselves in balance.
Maybe that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah. So, like in the Western tradition, you start in a snaffle bit, then you move to what's called a bosal. And a bosal is like a rawhide ring that goes around the nose, but it has no bit at all,
Right.
right? Because the idea is you're not using the bit to control,
Aha.
right? So what the bosal does is if the horse lifts the head, drops the back, then they get a little pressure on the nose. So they learn to sort of, some of them will get behind the vertical, but the idea is it discourages them from putting their back down and their head up and neck up, right? Then from the Bosal, you go into what they call the spade bit, which is just another
Mm-hmm.
word for a curb bit.
Right.
But you go into a spade bit and very traditionally a bosalito, which is a small bosal, right? So they'll make bosalitos out of horsehair, and it's kind of the equivalent of the English bit and bradoon. So
Okay.
you have the bosalito if you need a little help left to right, but then the curb is really helping maintain the front back balance and stabilizing the left right balance, but only after the horse knows how to do that. So
I was going to say, yeah.
it's more of a reminder than it is a tool to teach the horse to do that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So again, if you think of that leverage action, if a horse falls forward during competition or something athletic, a light touch on the reins is a lot of leverage to help the horse not fall forward,
Okay.
right? So it should be a reminder, not a tool to hold the front end up, which is what it
Oh,
has
that's big.
become.
Yes, that's big.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
So theoretically, oh, and then sorry, the final phase of Western training is what they call straight up in the bridle, which means basically you're on a slack rein in a curb bit or shank bit or what they call a bridle in Western training is a curb bit,
Right.
right? So that frees up the rider's hand, one hand, for roping or shooting or doing something, right? So you have this horse in self-carriage that you can ride with one hand on the reins and make minute adjustments to help the horse stay in self-carriage while your other hand is free to rope a cow or do something, right? And the same idea in the English tradition. You start in the snaffle and then you move into what's called a bit and bradoon. So
Mm-hmm.
the bit is the curb, right? The spade bit, it's the same. It's a bit with a shank, but then the horse also carries a smaller snaffle bit in the mouth with the curb bit. So the horse carries two bits and there's two sets of reins, right? So you can continue to have the isolated left-right action of the snaffle, but you have more leverage to help the horse not fall forward,
Right.
right? And again, traditionally, we moved the horse in self-carriage that's now athletic and agile. That bit and bradoon allowed the rider to help the horse maintain balance or give direction with one hand, while the other hand could carry the sword and fight,
Mm. A bit
right?
outdated.
Right. So if you look at the classical schools where you're basically dressage was training for warfare, right?
Right.
And 3-day eventing was military training. And so by the time you're in a bit and bradoon, the way they show it now is the rider carries the whip upright in one hand and rides with the other on the reins. So that's the tradition behind it, whether it's Western or English. Now, do you have to go into a curb bit? Some shows require it at certain levels. Some
Right.
breed organizations say your horse should be in a curb by 5 to 7 years old. You know, they're sort of pushing an agenda.
It's a
And
good way
so
to put it.
we've lost the meaning behind it. So
Yes,
yes,
I totally agree.
there are a lot of horses out there that would do better in a snaffle, but they're being ridden in a curb or a bit and bradoon or a curb bit,
Well,
right?
and it completely depends upon, like you said, the leverage of it all and how us as humans use that.
Yeah. And basically, if you were following traditional classical training, by the time you're in a curb, you're not using it for brakes. You're not
Ah,
using it to slow the horse down or control the speed. You're not using it for steering leverage. All of that is happening from the rider's seat.
right.
So the weight of the curb and the steadiness of a curb is just there to help the horse maintain self-carriage. The bit itself is heavy and stable, which helps a horse on a loose rein. It facilitates light aids and steadiness within the self-carriage. So people have the most common understandings that they need the leverage for control,
Yeah.
right? Or that if they need control, what defines a snaffle is the jointed mouthpiece. So they get one with more leverage that also has a shank.
Oh, wow.
And I go, that's kind of a bad combination because it doesn't
Hmm.
actually help the way it's supposed to in either way.
Right.
It actually becomes a confusing bit for the horse because if you
Wow.
use the right rein, you're not isolating the balance or the weight on the right side. You also have you have a lot of leverage that's acting backwards.
That's the image that I'm getting, or when I, watch upper level competitions, um, that's what I see. And
Yeah, and what you also see over and over and over in all forms of competition is horses that are dropping the pole, over curling the neck,
mm,
which means their weight is on too much on the front legs.
right.
But the horse has learned to escape the pressure of the bit. When they over curl the neck, they shift the pressure off their lower jaw into the corners of the mouth where it doesn't hurt so much.
That
That,
makes sense.
that's why they over curl the neck. In no way, shape, or form will that ever cause a horse to lift the back.
No, it
And
doesn't.
that's the theory. We think if we
Wow.
apply more leverage to the bit and drive them forward, the only option is to lift the back. And I go, that is not the only option.
That's not what I'm seeing.
No, and horses know that is not the only option. They have
Yeah.
all kinds of ways to escape. So the drawback of going into a curb bit too soon is that if you're acting with that much leverage front to back and the horse can't do it, isn't prepared, is not in self-carriage, is not
Hmm.
strong, has not been properly trained, then they escape through the left-right functions of the spine.
Right.
But with that much leverage, we have no idea that the horse is crooked. We have no idea that there's an internal twist going on or an invisible lateral bend happening, which is the
Hmm.
horse's escape mechanism from too much pressure on their jaw. So, in other words, we think if we drive them forward and create a wall with the bit, then the only
Mm.
option is to go up,
Up.
right? And I go, oh no, they escape through the side door all the time.
Is
So
that
you,
when you say that, is that like a horse bowing out around a turn? I mean, that's a big example, but I'm trying to think of a good example.
yeah, a big example would
That's a
be,
big one, but it can be even smaller than that.
yeah, so an example of a hidden lateral bend or twist would be difficult to steer for whatever reason from the
Mm.
seat, right?
From your seat.
Especially from your seat. If you
Yeah,
still, in
I
a
agree.
leveraged bit, if you're still having to pull on reins to steer, then you likely have an invisible, hard to detect lateral bend or twist somewhere in the spine, right? So hard to steer would be alert,
Okay.
right?
Hard to
Um,
steer, like the horse bows out,
drops a
going around,
shoulder,
drops the
bulges a
shoulder.
shoulder,
Okay.
loses the path of travel, or can't stay on the path of travel without a bazillion aids from the rider.
Okay.
Like if they're internally straight, steering is pretty easy.
Yeah, I mean, I've got one, well, one horse at least that internally, I can use my body to turn her without using reins.
Yeah. The other way we know if we've been riding in a curb, the other way we know that our horse has an internal dysfunction related to the left to right functions of the spine are lateral bending and rotation, which is a twisting action of the spine. And they can increase twist or lateral bend as an avoidance of lifting the back.
Right.
And we don't feel it in a curb as clearly as we can feel it in a snaffle.
Well, that
That's
makes sense.
the main difference, right? And so the other way we might figure out our horse has been doing that, even if we have ease of steering, would be the saddle fitter wants to flock your saddle more on one side than the other. You have asymmetrical muscle development through the back and the hindquarter. You have a
Yep.
tight side and a supple side. You have a good side and a bad side.
Or I've noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, a horse that has that, their blanket will always be twisted
To one side.
to one side.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, the
like, oh,
saddle
there
goes
it
off.
is.
The saddle constantly goes off to one side.
Yep.
The saddle pad goes off to one side, or even in a stall or paddock, the blanket goes off to one side.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a habitual. Well, you know, as an Alexander technique instructor, how many people carry too much lateral bend or twist as a habit. They still
Yes.
function, but
Oh,
how
yeah.
often do you come across that with people?
Oh, and it's as simple as asking somebody when you get out of the car or when you're going upstairs, which foot do you use first? There's always a habitual dominant leg, shall we say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I noticed when I put my pants on in the morning, it's always right
That's a
leg
good.
first. And so I started putting my pants on left leg first, and it was so awkward.
I have to
It's
think. I like,
so
okay,
awkward.
wait a minute. I can do this.
Yeah. But I had to like rebalance just to start with the
Totally.
opposite leg.
Yeah. Yeah. Or
Absolutely.
all of that stuff that it's so habitual in our daily routine, we don't think about changing it.
Well, and I find like we're all built symmetrically, but no single person I've ever met and no single horse that I've ever met automatically travels or moves symmetrically.
Exactly.
We're all one side dominant.
Mhm.
And we even have a term for that with horses. We call them left-handed horses and right-handed horses,
Yeah.
just like we have left-handed people and right-handed people. So if we're already starting like to train ourselves to be ambidextrous is part of developing self-carriage, to
Yeah,
use
I like that.
ourselves equally, right? And that's why I obviously in this podcast prefer working in a snaffle for that reason. Because
Yeah,
every
I can't remember
time,
the last time I used a curb bit.
yeah, and they can be used. I'm not speaking against curb bits. They can be
Right.
used judiciously and efficiently and very well. But typically, by the time you would put your horse in a curb, you no longer need a bit at all for control.
That's my point. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're going to a curb because we want bigger brakes
Oh,
or we want more leverage because our horse is a bit crazy and unpredictable, that can lead to a lot of problems. Like I've dealt with, I think the first horse breed that comes to mind is Pasafinos. And I've ridden several Pasafinos that just run through the leverage.
wow, that's scary.
Yeah. So if we use leverage too soon or we're using it for the wrong reason, a horse can learn to take the bit in their teeth and a
And
horse can
oh my
learn
gosh.
to dull themselves. Like if you
Mhm.
escalate adrenaline high enough, that leverage isn't going to work.
Gonna do anything.
It
Yeah.
isn't going to do anything. The horses can run right through it.
And
And
I know what I see is people using leverage and then they have to get some sort of tie down.
Yeah.
And we'll probably go into that in another podcast, but it's like, oh, if I take one Tylenol, five would be better,
Yeah. Yeah. And at a certain point, that can really work against you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So let's get into mouthpieces because that's another big question. So the mouthpiece is the part of the bit that goes in the horse's mouth, right? Where the reins attach are the sides of the horse's mouth or below. So what defines a snaffle is on the side of the horse, on the corner of the horse's mouth, you have either what's called a loose ring,
Hmm.
an egg butt, which is sort of an egg-shaped ring, a D ring, which is a D-shaped ring, a full cheek, which is like a up and down bar. There's all kinds of rings on the side of a
Hmm.
snaffle, and there's all kinds of mouthpieces that go through the horse's mouth. But what keeps it a snaffle is no shank.
Okay.
You can't attach the reins below the corners of the horse's mouth. That's what makes it a snaffle. Now, inside the horse's mouth, like I said, you can have no joints. You can have a solid mouthpiece, right? And this is where it could be rubber, it could be metal, it could have copper parts, it could just be stainless steel. There's a gazillion different
Yeah, there
mouthpieces,
are.
right? But the essential,
Ranging in a gazillion different prices too.
yes. Yeah. Yeah, and it's sort of seductive that
Yeah.
the bit makers are telling you if you use this bit, it'll help your horse lift its back. And I go,
Wow,
that's
that's
not
that's a
really
liability.
true. That's just not really true. So you have three types essentially of mouthpieces. You have a solid mouthpiece, you have two types of jointed mouthpieces. So the joint means it's not solid, right?
Right.
So there's a single joint, which is just two pieces of metal that join in the middle of the mouth. And then there's what's called a French link, which is three pieces of metal and two joints, right? So the mouthpiece, what I find interesting about the mouthpiece is horses that tend to be noodly and wiggly in their movement, they do better with a steadier mouthpiece, either a solid or single jointed mouthpiece.
That makes total sense to me.
And then the horses that are a bit like tense and stiff and um, tight muscularly,
Hmm.
they do a little better in the French link
That's so funny
mouthpiece.
because that's exactly what I'm doing here. So my big mare is the stiff one and she likes the French link, where my wiggly mare I've got in just a one joint snaffle.
Yeah.
Because I
So
feel like I can control left to right better.
well,
Does
it's
that
not
make
just
sense?
that. If you think of it in terms of physics, every force we apply to the rein, right? If it's going through a solid mouthpiece, that's like an uninterrupted transmission of
Okay, that
force.
makes sense.
As it starts to go through one joint, there's a little movement in there. As it goes through two joints, there's more movement in that
That makes
transmission.
sense.
So there's little waves or ripples as we add more joints to the mouthpiece. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So the wiggly ones, they want a steadier feel because that's what they lack. Steadier communication,
right.
clearer transmission. And the stiff ones, they can perceive that as like something to push against.
My mare would get agitated. That's why I switched her to the French link. She just got real mouthy and, was more focused on what was in her mouth than what we were doing.
Yeah. And so they sort of like a looser transmission. It, in a
Hmm.
sense, it makes it gentler.
Maybe
So
that's it for
the
her. Yeah.
force applied to the rein going through several joints. And that's why a lot of people just go straight to a French link and don't think about whether their horse is stiff or wiggly. they go to a French link because theoretically it's a softer bit
Mm-hmm.
for the horse. And a lot of people don't like the single joints because of what they call the nutcracker effect, which is if
Mm.
you pull on two reins with that single joint, the mouthpieces can sort of tent and push on the horse's palate.
Right.
And I go, yeah, but if you're not pulling back on the reins all the time, then you don't have the nutcracker effect. So it really depends on
Exactly.
how you ride.
I
It's not the bit.
It's not, that's what it boils down to. It's what you do with what you have that makes the difference.
It's what you do with the reins that
Yeah.
really determines the actual action of the bit, right? And then with mouthpieces, we also have the two categories of thinner or thicker,
Mm,
right? So thinner means the pounds per square inch is spread over a thinner surface area. So
right.
that increases pressure. And a thicker bit, the pounds per square inch is distributed over a greater surface area, so it's less forceful, right? But like I said with my horse, it also depends on how that bit fits in their unique jaw, unique teeth.
Right.
So kind of checking your bit with your equine dentist is always a good idea.
I'm going to do that next time my dentist comes.
Yeah. And just say, hey, based on what you're seeing in my horse's mouth, do you think this size bit is appropriate, is
Yeah.
a comfortable fit? Right. So we have tradition, we have theory, and then we have the actual horse. Right. But I do have to say across the board, and it was counterintuitive because wiggly horses are always over flexing the neck, dropping the poll, and you kind of want to go to a gentler bit because they appear to not like the bit. They're always
Right.
fussing,
They're
wiggly
fussy.
horses are always fussing in the mouths and sticking their tongue out. So we tend to go to gentler bits with wiggly horses. And it was like, well, with my Arab, I went through bit after bit after bit because she was just horrible with bits. She just hated bits, right? And I started with a loose ring and kept the bit loose in her mouth and hardly touched the reins. And she still acted like I was killing her with the bit. And after going through, like we all do, we all go through our bit phase. And after going through about 20 different bits trying to solve the problem of her busy mouth, the only bit I found that reduced the mouthy issue, which really had to do with her balance.
Exactly.
It
It's
didn't
just
have to
a
do with the bit.
expression of discomfort.
But the bit I found she liked, I special ordered from England. It was handmade. It was heavy. It was
Oh, like
thick.
thick,
It
thick and
was
heavy?
and handmade, so it actually had like weight to it. It was a couple of pounds. And
Wow.
and it was what's called a Fulmer full cheek snaffle, which is used by the Spanish School of Riding in Vienna. And so it's a full cheek, but you use it with bit keepers, which are little leather
Right.
pieces that hold the top of the full cheek steady. And then you actually attached the reins to a ring. So it was like a full cheek with a ring on the outside. And you attach
Interesting.
the reins to a ring. And theoretically, it's supposed to help isolate the left right from the front back action of the bit. So it is the Spanish School of Riding classical bit. So I ordered one of those, handmade, very heavy, very steady, single jointed with keepers, is basically going to
So
give
it's
it,
very still.
it gives it the action of a solid bar through the
Okay,
mouth,
that
right?
makes
Even
sense.
though it's single jointed. Loved it. Loved that bit. Wiggly little mouthy Arab. That was the bit where she got quiet. It fit her mouth. She's like, okay, I can manage this. Because if you think of a wiggly horse and a wiggly bit, how do you have a clear transmission in your rein aids,
Yeah.
right? There's just too many wiggly forces going on. So the steadier the bit and the heaviness she seemed to really like, right? So instead of a hollow mouthpiece, which are a lot of big bits have a hollow mouthpiece to
Right.
keep them lightweight, this was a solid mouthpiece. And so
Wow.
it really had some weight. And that opened my eyes completely. And then I started really experimenting. Like these stiff, bracy horses tend to get steadier and more leveraged bits. And what they really want is less leverage, less steadiness because they're too stiff. So they want something softer in the communication.
Yeah, that's the difference between my two.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've found it's pretty much across the board as a general rule of thumb. People will ask me what kind of bit should I get? And my first question is, would you say your horse is wiggly or stiff?
Mm,
Right. And then if they're still developing self-carriage, definitely a snaffle over a curb.
right. Yeah. And even the way they're used, I think, is the most important thing, what we do with them in our hands.
Definitely. Because it's really, and Ray Hunt, who was a famous horse whisperer type cowboy, he used to say, when people would ask him, what kind of bit should I use? And he would say, if I have enough feel, I could use a barbed wire bit to start a colt.
Yeah.
And
That to me is the important piece, is what
that
you
was
use it for.
yeah, his cowboy way of saying it doesn't matter.
It's how you use it.
It's how you use it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think that's what's lacking because as humans, we feel like if we get the right tool, it will
Yes,
fix our problems.
the right footing, the right shoes, the right.
Right. But it's kind of like me, like trying to learn construction skills. I went out and bought the DeWalt drill and, the premier like construction tools. That doesn't mean I know how to use them. I still can't
Exactly.
cut a straight line with my skill saw. It's just like it's still, even if you have a tool, yes, that does make your job a little easier if you have the right tool for the right job, but you still have to know how to use it.
Right. And I don't know if that is being taught.
That is the difference.
Yeah,
Because if we think, what are we using the bit for?
right.
Right?
Well, most people they think it's for stop and go,
Yeah. Number one, people need it for brakes,
right?
right? Number two, steering,
Yep,
right? So I go, okay, if you need a lot of leverage to slow your horse down or control the speed, then the horse inherently, the horse is not in self-carriage because the
exactly.
braking mechanism, if the braking mechanism inside the horse's body, which is a coordination and specific muscle use, if that mechanism is not working, then you feel it in your hands. That's why we go to
And
more
what would you
leverage.
describe it as?
Describe the
What you feel in your hands?
heaviness.
Yeah, and I
And
think the instinct of the rider is to pull back, because that's
yeah,
just a habitual instinct for humans, is to shorten and tighten around resistance, and that's the opposite of my work. Is, nobody's being taught lengthen your arm and shorten your reins. That sounds like it should
mm,
be a book.
mm. Yeah. So I would say in the early levels of riding, people are thinking of bits as brakes and
Yep,
for steering. And even in the advanced levels of riding, people think you need the leverage to help the horse lift the front end.
oh,
So
ayurvede.
I go, if we're using the bit for any of those three reasons, then our horse lacks self-carriage.
Exactly.
And really, you would learn more about self-carriage and balance using a snaffle.
You can feel more, I think,
Hmm.
if
You
you're
can feel
listening
more.
instead of controlling.
Well, you still have leverage in a snaffle.
Yeah, you do.
It's not leverage less.
Right.
And actually, if we just talk quickly about bitless bridles, right? So there are hackamores, mechanical hackamores, that are just as much leverage as a curb, but the
Yes.
action is happening on the upper jaw, on the nose, instead of the lower jaw in the mouth. But the leverage can be just as intense, and the use of the
Exactly.
reins can be the same. Or a bitless bridle, like a side pull, or I think it was, what is it, Dr. Cook's or something like that, bitless
Mm.
bridle. You're taking the bit out of the mouth, but you're not necessarily alleviating the leverage of the reins.
Yep, that's how
So
I see it.
in training, I talk a lot more about rein use, no matter what bit the person has in their horse's mouth.
Right.
I go, it's really the rein use, whether you have a bit, don't have a bit, have a hackamore or a bitless bridle versus a snaffle versus a leveraged bit or a curb. It's really the interplay of forces between our arms through the
Exactly.
reins to the horse's upper or lower jaw, right? And
Yes.
reins are two-way transmitters. We receive as much information through our rein contact about the horse's balance as we can give through our rein aids.
I don't feel that I don't hear that in training circles very often.
Right. When we pick up the reins, what I see a lot is a constant rein aid. There's very little listening going on through the
Exactly.
contact. So
We're
people
too
are,
dewy with our hands. We're always too dewy with our hands.
it's human nature. I would
It
say
is.
actually developing the skill of using the reins, especially related to balance and self-carriage, is one of the hardest contacts for humans to develop.
I agree.
It is a tricky one to get good at because we're hand oriented.
Mhm.
And if we're thinking of leverage and control through the reins, shaping the horse's head and neck into a frame, not
Right.
letting our horse fall forward, holding them propped up in our hands, or keeping the speed control through the bit, or getting the steering through the bit. All of those tell us we're still really working with constant rein aids.
AIDS, which is a contraction in the human arm-hand
Not necessarily,
relationship.
I wouldn't say it's a contraction necessarily. An aid is where we're talking,
And yeah,
and a contact is where we're listening.
yeah,
But to pick up reins and have a listening sensation through the reins into our hands, into our arms, into our back, into our central nervous system, we really only feel when they're pulling. We
hmm,
really only feel the horse when it's making our biceps work,
right.
right? But there's a whole lot more information we could gain at a subtle level, no matter what bit we're using. And that's the other reason I prefer a snaffle is the leverage action of being able to, let's say 1 pound of pressure in our hands equals 100 pounds of pressure in the horse's mouth when you add inches below the mouth
Right,
to catch the reins. That not only increases leverage, but it has the effect of muffling what we can feel in a contact. Because the horse could be out of balance, 100 pounds of body weight too much on the front legs, but we still feel lightness in our reins, right?
that's scary.
In a snaffle, we're going to feel the difference when the horse shifts 10 pounds of body weight to the front legs. We're going to
Hmm.
feel that in our hands, right? But in a curb, we're not going to feel it until the horse has 100, 200 extra pounds of weight on the front end. Then we feel the pulling,
Right,
right? So the leverage is sort of a two-edged sword. It can work very well for us with a horse that's in self-carriage because the aids are super subtle and very light, so we have one hand free for business, right? But in a snaffle, we feel faster or sooner and much more clearly when that weight inside the horse, when the horse is losing self-carriage, they're essentially losing control over their own body weight.
right,
So if the weight's going too much to the front legs, we feel that sooner and we feel more of it.
right.
If the weight's shifting left and right, too much left, too much right, we also feel that more clearly and we feel it sooner. which means we can correct the imbalance sooner. So a lot of people I see riding in curbs, and especially curbs with jointed mouthpieces, right? That's actually called a tom thumb bit, very traditional Western trail
Right.
riding bit. I go, you get no information.
I agree.
You get no information for that from that bit. And so, and it's very hard when you try to give resistance to help them balance left to right or front to back. A
You don't
rein,
have, yeah, it's really, you don't have the ability with a curb.
right, because you can't isolate the left right.
You can't isolate left, right.
So you have a lot of leverage to prevent the fall forward, but you won't feel and really are restricted in the action of correcting a left-right weight imbalance,
Hmm.
right? So, and the mouthpiece, I go, like, people ask me, what's the best snaffle bit? I go, it just really, to me, doesn't matter.
It depends.
Can I ride in a regular halter or a side pull bitless bridle? I go, yeah, absolutely. As long as you have two distinct attachments, left and right,
Oh,
then the
okay.
halter or the bit. There are some bitless bridles that cross under the
That's what
jaw.
I've seen. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about that.
That actually muffles the left-right distinct
Yeah,
action.
because you,
So it acts more like a curb than it does a
wow,
snaffle. And if you get into a hackamore where the reins are attached to these long metal bits below the nose, below the mouth, so even if you don't have a bit in the mouth, the reins should still attach at that location,
right.
right? And if they're attached below the mouth or if there's a crossing under the jaw, those are the leverage actions,
Yeah,
with or without a bit. Excuse me. So for me, if I'm developing balance and self-carriage, the snaffle is the better tool.
yeah.
With or without a bit, any type of snaffle, solid mouthpiece, single jointed mouthpiece, French link or double jointed mouthpiece, rubber, metal, copper inlays, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
It's like, it just doesn't matter that much. It's really the action of the reins that makes the difference.
I agree.
And then how the rider's using the reins and their understanding of balance makes also a big difference.
Yeah.
Man, I have been talking. You talk.
I agree with it all. I mean, to me, it's not about what you have, it's what you do with what you have.
Yeah,
You
the
know,
tool.
I've seen some pretty poor examples of use with all types of bits.
And I've seen some good examples of use with what I would consider unusable bits.
Right,
I go, not my favorite bit, but the rider is getting the job done because of the understanding of balance.
right. So I think it's really boils down to the education of the rider and what
Yeah,
they've been taught.
yeah. And I think the obsession with bits, like if you open any tack store catalog or go to any tack store, there are walls of bits,
Hmm.
anywhere from $10 to $100 for a bit. I go, and everybody's promising something.
Yeah. I remember once I walked into a tack store. I had just gotten my halflinger, and the owner of the store says, "Oh yeah, halflingers, you have to use a Kimberwick." Like,
Yeah, yeah,
why?
yeah. Gaited
Explain
horses.
to me
Gaited
why.
horses. You need at least a 4-inch shank, if not 6 or 7 inches.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
actually in a clinic with another horse person, and I actually asked, it was an Alexander teacher that was riding, and I actually asked her, why do you have a shank on this horse?
What'd she say?
She had no clue. She just said, that's what I always ride in.
And she had no idea why.
No.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's that tradition of You've got a gaited horse, you use this. You've got a halflinger, you use this.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah. And even it's like when my high school horse, the first horse I ever owned, off the track thoroughbred, I rode in a snaffle because I was a hunter rider. That's what you rode in.
right.
And he kept running away with me. So, of course, like everybody else, the first thing I did is go to the tack store, look for a bigger bit, and they sold
Yep.
me a twisted wire snaffle, a
Oh, yes, I had
double
those days
twisted
too.
wire snaffle.
I had those days too.
And so I had the leverage, and guess what? He went faster. He blew right through it, right?
Right.
Then I come to find out years later, the more you pull back on a racing thoroughbred, the faster they go.
Yeah,
That's how they're trained at the track. I go, instead of selling me a more leveraged bit, somebody could have told me, don't
right.
pull and he won't go so fast, right?
It's all in the teachings.
Yeah. So it was like now an off the track thoroughbred, every instinct in our body says pull back, right? And they just go faster.
Yep,
Because when they want them to gallop on the track, they shorten up those reins. They're all in snaffles.
yep,
Racehorses are all in snaffles. And they shorten the reins and pull backwards a little bit in order to increase the support for a faster speed,
yeah,
right? So it's not the bit, it's how you use it.
exactly.
Yep. And the more
Exactly.
leverage I used on my off the track thoroughbred and the more I pulled on the reins, the longer he ran away, the faster he ran away. I went, oh, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Somebody should have clued me in.
Yeah.
But anything else you want to add?
Yep,
I think
that's
we've
good.
covered a significant amount of bits and bitless bridles. And
Yes.
just a quick recap. A snaffle, like you said at the beginning, is not defined by the jointed mouthpiece.
Okay.
A snaffle is defined as a snaffle because the reins attach to the corners of the horse's mouth and they're not connected side to side and they're not below the corners of the horse's mouth. So even
Right.
like a kimberwick is a sneaky shank.
Sneaky.
It's a
I
sneak
I
because it
mean, you can
looks
use
like a
it in
D
many
ring.
different ways, really.
Yeah. But there's a lot of bits like the three rings and the kimberwicks where you're actually attaching the reins half inch or an inch below the corners of the mouth.
You can, yeah,
That
and then
that's a curb action,
yep,
right? So a snaffle is strictly defined by the reins attaching at the corners of the mouth on the horse, right? A curb is defined by attaching the reins anywhere below the sides of the mouth. And the longer or the lower below the corners of the mouth that the reins attach, the more leverage is increased. So for every half inch or inch you go down to attach the reins, the more you're increasing pounds per square inch inside the horse's mouth for every pound you put on the reins. That's a difference. And I go,
and
there's
it's
really just those two types of bits.
yep, and
Yeah.
it's just how you use it that makes the difference.
Yes. Yes. So I think we'll wrap it up there. And thank you everyone for joining us for another Horse Geeks podcast. We hope you liked it. Please subscribe, share, comment, blah, 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 and we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.